Washington Journal continues.
And now on your screen is Representative Steve King, a Republican of Iowa, as we continue our discussion of what the President had to say last night. Congressman King, do you agree that it's time to withdraw from Afghanistan? Do you think that, philosophically, do you agree with that position?
Well, I don't know if I can answer that in a philosophical context, because at this point, I don't yet know what's going on tactically on the ground. When President Obama was sworn in, I continued going to the classified briefings as we had under George Bush, and it shifted from knowing the classified tactical answers to more political answers in the briefings. So I'm frustrated that I don't think I know what's going on the ground. I don't think I'm able to find out. I get back channel information from people that serve there, and I have conversations with people that are fairly well positioned, but I don't have the full picture of what's going on the ground. I'm uneasy about where we are as far as our tactical objectives, and I've long believed, though, that our military will perform and will accomplish those missions that are set out for them. I don't have any reason to believe they've not. I think they have. But it's the other side of this. It's the nation-building component. It's the effort of the State Department and USAID and the other entities that are trying to stand up a government in a place where it's never existed. I don't know about the progress of that, and I'd like to hear some input from the White House that gives me a higher level of confidence that we're ready for this move.
I want to see what you have to say about John McCain's statement following the President's address last night. Here's what he had to say. I know that Americans are war-weary and fed up with our unsustainable national debt. But what our country can least afford is the cost of failure in Afghanistan. It remains a vital national interest for the U.S. to succeed.
I would agree with that statement. And I think that sometimes the war-weary overcomes our look at the long-distance view of our national destiny. And I'm one in the House who takes a view that once we engage in an operation, it's our obligation to succeed. That big decision of going in is a very tough one. And for example, with Libya, I would not have voted to or ordered troops into Libya or the operations that the President did. But once we're there, it's a different equation. And I think that's where John McCain and I agree. And I think he would agree with me that for the President to announce deployment of pulling troops out of Afghanistan on a timetable, and that timetable is pretty much consistent with the timetable that he announced when he ordered the surge, it is the wrong tactic to tell our enemy that we're going to fight a war by the date on the calendar, by the numbers that are predicted. It tells them what they need to do, whether they're going to try to match up against our forces or whether they're going to go underground and wait us out. This tells them, go underground and wait us out. It's been 10 years, a couple more years, and there won't be opposition in Afghanistan, and that opens it up for the Taliban to come back into Afghanistan. We know what they did to Afghanistan after the Russians were gone, and that vacuum was filled. There was a power vacuum after the Russians. It was filled by the Taliban, and that laid the foundation for al-Qaeda to go into Afghanistan, which launched the attack on the United States September 11th.
Steve King is our guest, Republican of Iowa. I want to let you know that we have set aside a phone line this morning for Afghanistan war vets, and we want to hear from you definitely. 202-737-2579 is that number. So if you served in Afghanistan, we want to hear from you. Congressman, before we go to calls, I want to play just a little bit of President Obama from last night and get your reaction.
The goal that we seek is achievable and can be expressed simply. No safe haven from which al-Qaeda or its affiliates can launch attacks against our homeland or our allies. We won't try to make Afghanistan a perfect place. We will not police its streets or patrol its mountains indefinitely. That is the responsibility of the Afghan government, which must step up its ability to protect its people and move from an economy shaped by war to one that can sustain a lasting peace. What we can do and will do is build a partnership with the Afghan people that endures, one that ensures that we will be able to continue targeting terrorists and supporting a sovereign Afghan government.
Congressman King.
My reaction is, those are nice words that the President has spoken, and they're actually inspiring words. And when I hear them, though, and I question this, that a little later on in his speech, he talked about how they were going to build a partnership and oppose Afghanistan. But the gap in there is that one of the partners in this, in these negotiations, is the Taliban. And we went in to take on and fight Afghanistan, or fight in Afghanistan to take out al-Qaeda. But what emerged for our enemy was the Taliban. The Taliban have been our enemy in Afghanistan from actually the beginning. The Northern Alliance drove the Taliban out of Afghanistan. They were the ones who opened their doors to al-Qaeda. Now we have negotiations going on. 6 or 7 months ago, some of us were critical of Karzai for having negotiations with the Taliban, and the rumors were that the White House had people in that meeting and were involved in or at least observing negotiations. Now we have reports of open negotiations with the Taliban. It sounds, and I listened to this, like the White House has opened the door for and perhaps has some kind of a tacit agreement that there will be a power-sharing agreement in Afghanistan with the Taliban. I don't want to be negotiating with our enemies. I know what they did in Afghanistan the last time, and our objective was to remove them, and I think that should remain the objective of our effort in Afghanistan, remove the Taliban from power. And by the way, all Taliban are Pashtun. Karzai is Pashtun. And that's not true that all Pashtun are Taliban, but what we see there's a tribal affinity for the Taliban, and I would think the Northern Alliance would look at this with significant alarm.
Steve King is our guest, and our first call for him comes from Panama City Beach. Alan, on our Afghanistan War Veterans line. Alan, if you could tell us about your service, and then go ahead with your question or comment for the Congressman.
Yes, hi. Good morning, Congressman.
Good morning, Alan.
I've got actually 3 tours, 2 in Iraq and one recent one in Afghanistan. I just retired, 30 years out of the Army. My question is, you know, a lot of people are misunderstanding about the surge. We actually had about 36,000 troops in there, and then the Bush administration increased it to about 70,000, and then we ended up with the Obama surge, which actually doubled down on that and got us up to around the 100 mark, and we really made a big difference fighting the Taliban, especially in the South, but kind of ignored the RC East area. It kind of was disappointing when we pulled out of the Korengal Valley. I know the tactics changed, but there was a lot of fighting up there that I'm not sure we'll ever solve.
So, Alan, what did you think of what the President had to say last night?
I kind of think it's about time to start pulling out of there, and just a simple reason. It's just the country is just so huge. I don't think people really understand how big it is.
All right. Thank you for calling in this morning, Congressman King.
Well, first, Alan, thanks for your service to this country, and 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan in 30 years is it's a lot more than we would ask of anybody. And what you've told me, that your view on Afghanistan and what took place there is historically spot on, and from your perspective, I have that sense you have a lot more to say. I look at this and what I've said in my reservations, because I don't know tactically what's going on the ground from an intel standpoint, even though I go to the classified briefings. But my view is that we should, once we start an operation, we should be successful in that operation, because for one thing, Osama bin Laden was encouraged he believed that America didn't have the resolve to complete the engagements that we've begun. At a certain time, I was sitting in a hotel room a hotel room over in the east, ready to go into Iraq the next day. And as I watched on Al Jazeera TV, Muqtada al-Sadr came on, and I remember the date. It was June 11th, 2004. And that fellow with his Mahdi militia and his big old burly beard and missing teeth said, and I believe in Arabic, but there was an English closed caption, he said, if we continue attacking Americans, they will leave Iraq the same way that they left Vietnam, the same way they left Lebanon, the same way they left Mogadishu. That was a pretty clear message that they were recruiting militia against the United States, believing we didn't have resolve. That's what inspired Osama bin Laden as well. And I want to make sure that when we leave Afghanistan, that we also leave the message that America has the resolve to complete those engagements that we began and do so successfully. And that saves American lives in the long run. And I believe that you have stepped forward and saved a lot of American lives, and it's tragedy those we've lost. There's a destiny of America that you have stepped forward to protect, and I'm concerned about protecting it as well. And
Carl from San Antonio, Texas, has a similar voice. The U.S., this is an email, has not been victorious in war since World War II. In WW2, Eisenhower in Europe and Nimitz in the Pacific were directed to be victorious. In Korea, MacArthur wanted to win, but he was prevented from doing so because of politics, and it has remained so to this day.
Peter, if I could add to
yes, sir.
That is a spot-on comment that I never hear. And it takes me back to General Giap in Vietnam, who was credited with the Vietnamese victory. That they call it a victory, and I'd argue on that. But he wrote a little book about the victory. And on page 8 of that book, and I wouldn't recommend anybody bother to read it. It isn't a very good book. But he says he got his first inspiration, General Giap of Vietnam, his first inspiration on how to defeat the United States, because we were willing to accept a negotiated settlement in Korea. Now, if you read that and frame that with what I've said about Muqtada al-Sadr and Osama bin Laden, that tells you what the rest of the world thinks of America's resolve. We've reestablished our resolute reputation in Iraq, and I don't want to lose it in Afghanistan.
Brooklyn, Chris, Republican line, you're on with Congressman Steve King. Brooklyn, one more chance.
Hello.
Hi,
Hello.
go ahead, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you for C-SPAN, and thank you, Congressman, for taking my call.
Thank you.
Congressman, I was going to ask you a different question, but since those last couple really have led into something else, do you think we should still be in Germany? Do you think we should still be in Japan, Korea? And what occupying forces would we tolerate in our country because they think that we're too dangerous? We really should not be, and I'm not a Ron Paul fan except on this one point, we really should not be having the type of military imperialism that says, well, we're going there, and we're going to do it until we've bled enough. I think we've bled enough. And again, I'm a staunch Republican. I don't believe in preemptive war, but I do believe in being strong. And one last comment, and I'll go. The reason why we had victory in Germany and Japan was that we killed everybody and we're willing to firebomb Dresden. We're not willing to do that in this day and age to Kabul or to Crete. Thank you.
Well, on your points, the two of the three countries that you've mentioned, we didn't have a lot of choice. We didn't have choice on Japan. We didn't have a choice in Germany except their domination of the world. And we were attacked. And when we were attacked by the Japanese, immediately Hitler declared war on the United States. That all-out war was something that we had to do for national survival. And I'm glad we had the resolve to complete those wars with a total 100% defeat of our enemy and complete surrender of our enemy. That was the goal. And Roosevelt made it very clear that that was the goal. And so and I look at Korea. We may have had a choice in Korea. We may have been able to say, let them go ahead and dominate militarily the continent of Asia. But we are there now in those countries, and they're glad to have us there. And we need those tactical locations. Ramstein in Germany is one of those essential locations that we run operations out of, tactical locations, also in Japan and in Korea to a lesser degree. So if we are going to be a global power, a global military force, we need bases around the world to do that. These are legitimately won bases, and their leases are at the consent of and often the welcome of the host countries. So the other alternative of that would be to bring our forces back home and sit here and wait for somebody to attack us. I think it's too dangerous a world to allow that to happen, but I thank you for your comments and your input.
And where does that lead into Libya and the resolutions tomorrow?
This is a question that I'm not completely resolved on yet, but I'm open to talk about how I view the Libya operation. First of all, knowing what I know now and knowing what I knew then, I would not have ordered this action into Libya. The President did, though, order the action. By the Constitution, he's the Commander-in-Chief of the United States military. He must have the authority to order our military into action in an instant without checking with anybody. We have to give the President the benefit of the doubt on that decision. Then, over a period of time, the operation transitions into the control or governance of the War Powers Act. I think the President is in, let's say, in violation at least of the spirit of the War Powers Act. He'll argue he's technically not in violation of it. And I would also question the War Powers Act's constitutionality. There's a question about whether that encroaches upon the authority of the Commander-in-Chief. It's never been resolved because the Presidents have honored the War Powers Act. The President has treated Congress with a significant disrespect. He has more respect for the Arab League than he has for the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate. I believe he has an obligation, whether it's under the War Powers Act or under the common understanding of how a three-branch of government functions, to come to Congress, make his case for the Libyan operation. And so we're going to try to get him to do that again to show proper respect for the United States Congress. If he fails to do that, there are a lot of members of this Congress, Democrats and Republican, that want to just pull the plug on the funding for Libya. Constitutionally, we can do that. I don't agree with that because we have started an operation in Libya. I'm glad that he pulled our military out of direct engagement of the enemy, with the exception of the predators, for example. And we're just flying support missions, refueling, and supporting the embargo and the tactical. And we're also helping with our intelligence to select targets for the other NATO operations that are going on. But we have an agreement with NATO. We have a NATO treaty. And I don't want to see Congress abrogate a treaty with NATO for the same reasons that I've described about America's resolve. If we demonstrate that we're not a reliable partner, there are a lot of rearrangements in the world that will take place. Eastern Europe will look at this and say, you took the missiles out of Poland and the radar out of Czechoslovakia, and now you pulled out of an agreement with NATO in the middle of an operation that's over Libya. America has to be a reliable partner, and I think the United States Congress ought to recognize that, regardless of whether we are of the same party or agree with the President's actions.
Steve King is in his 5th term as a Republican congressman from Iowa. Storm Lake and Sioux City are in his district. Columbus, Ohio. Phil, on our Afghanistan War Veterans line. Very quickly, Phil, tell us about your service, and then go ahead with your question or comment.
Hi, how are you today?
Good.
Morning, Phil.
I'd just like to say that all the people that serve in Afghanistan or anyone else are very proud people, and my big point is this. There's been remarks made in the past of soldiers and airmen and everyone being the teeth of the saw, so to speak, of the United States and its public policy and its foreign policy. And what happens is this: when you start to saw concrete, then the teeth of the saw unfortunately suffer dramatically. There's a disconnect between the and it often happens in corporate structures and also in government structures. There's a disconnect between the people on the ground and the people who are devising these policies. Let me make this very plain and very clear to you. When people are on the ground, people suffer, and people suffer very badly. When you have a government that is disconnected from the people on the ground and the veterans, I'll put it very plainly to you. There's a veterans organization that is a grassroots organization that started up. People donating money. People, actually public people donating money. No help from the government for brain injuries from veterans from Afghanistan and some from Iraq, but mostly.
Phil, are you suffering from a brain injury from combat?
No, one of my best friends is, and they came up with the medical building and built it from the ground and started to actually treat these people. No help from the government, no recognition from the government. It took $10 million of people that got their money to actually help these troops that were injured. And within, I would say 6 weeks, we started throwing all this stuff at Libya. Now, can you imagine this? In Libya...
Hey, Phil, you know what? We're going to have to leave it at that comment. I'm sorry.
I would say, Phil, I'm appreciate to hearing this, and I'm going to take a look at this and find out where the location is for the Center for Treating Brain Injuries, and I think that the military is starting to catch up with that. I can think of Congressman Tim Murphy, who is from Pennsylvania, who he's a little bit younger than me, but not very much. Joined the Navy. He's a professional psychiatrist, so that he could help out our military as they come back from that part of the world. And I appreciate Congressman Murphy for that, and there are many others that are stepping up, and I appreciate the private money effort that's there. That's a great thing about America. Thanks for serving our country.
James, McMinnville, Tennessee, on our Democrats line. You're on with Congressman Steve King. James, got one more chance. We've got to move on.
Hello.
Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I believe that the Fox networks and the Republican Party are doing more dangerous to this country than any terrorist.
James, could you give an example?
Yes, I think that sooner or later that WikiLeaks are going to come out and explain how some of these people before 9/11 knew what was going to happen, and I just think that we went there needlessly, and we've lost a lot of lives.
Thank you, sir. Congressman King, when you hear about 9/11 in that regard, and when you hear about WikiLeaks, what do you respond?
Well, my thoughts on it are that the talk about whether there was a conspiracy before 9/11, I'm absolutely convinced there was a conspiracy, and it was perpetrated by Al-Qaeda. And if anybody in the United States that was in a position to prevent this had known about it and believed in it, they would have stepped up to try to do that. We do not a very good job of running our government. So when you look at how government runs, and as haphazard as it turns out from time to time, it's hard for me to imagine that there could be a strategy of a conspiracy that they could actually pull off in that fashion and keep it a secret. So I have trouble with those conspiracy theories. And I have great sympathy for the people in this country that have taken the attacks September 11th in all three locations, as well as for those who have given their lives to settle this question and to fight Al-Qaeda back around the world.
WikiLeaks.
I'm on the WikiLeaks question. I wish that had never happened. And at this point, as far as significant damage for WikiLeaks, I don't quite see the significant damage. But over time, I think we'll find out the damage that is rolled out by WikiLeaks. And this is an act against the United States. It's almost an offensive act. It offends me. And from a legal standpoint, I'm not sure where that goes, but I would certainly support legal action against the people that are perpetrating the WikiLeaks.
Iowa caucuses are 6 months from right now. The straw poll is happening in August. The fact that you're from Iowa, we've got to talk a little bit about politics here. Are you disappointed? How do you feel about the fact that Mitt Romney and a couple others have pulled out of the August straw poll in Ames, Iowa? And who are you supporting for president at this point?
Well, when Mitt Romney announced he wouldn't participate in the Iowa straw poll, that told me immediately that he was seeking to diminish expectations in Iowa for the Iowa caucus. He didn't say he wouldn't be involved in the Iowa caucus. He said he wasn't going to be in the Iowa straw poll. We don't know whether he will engage in the caucus or not, and so I suspect if he can diminish expectations in Iowa, and he believes, and he's ahead in the polls in New Hampshire, he could win in New Hampshire, compete in South Carolina, that he could somehow at least skip the straw poll and perhaps skip the caucus. I'd say that if you're going to be a viable candidate and you can't compete in Iowa, you don't have much of an argument about being a viable candidate. What is it about Iowa that would say that the next president of the United States can't win there? We do reflect the heart of the Midwest and the values of America, and we have the most serious activists in the country, and they're competed very closely with by those in New Hampshire and South Carolina. Also, John Huntsman said that he wouldn't compete in Iowa because you have to be for ethanol to be in Iowa, which is not true. Tim Pawlenty has pretty well established that. The ethanol industry has stepped up and said, we'd like to ratchet this down and reach a soft landing. So there's an open field for people to come into Iowa. I would invite all candidates to come to Iowa, engage in the straw poll, certainly engage in the caucus. Don't fear the ethanol issue. It's a logical, economical issue, but step forward and see if you can compete in the marketplace of Midwesterners. Now, where I stand on the candidates is this. I want to see the most effective constitutional conservative nominated as possible. I think it's good for them to engage in the caucus process. It's good to go to a place where you have to get to know people a little bit personally, where it's a few people are around the table at a cup of coffee, and where people get to know you in front of the curtain and behind the curtain. And my focus is I want to preserve the First in the Nation caucus. I want to promote the First in the Nation primary in New Hampshire. I want to promote the effectiveness of the South Carolinians, who have been a great partner in this first three state system that's here. If we ever lose these components that I've described, the next president of the United States and every president thereafter would be the media personality created by the deep pockets of a lot of money, rather than having earned that trust by meeting people in a personal way. So the Iowa caucus performs an essential role. If it didn't exist in Iowa, I would want to create it somewhere else.
Last call for our guest, Steve King, Irwin, Pennsylvania. Marie, Independent Line. Please go ahead.
Hi. Oh, it's just so great to be able to speak with you. One thing I would like to say is that I have the most respect for, you're just coming right out and saying that you don't have the knowledge of tactical operations and so forth. And I think that's very important because anyone that's calling in wants to give their so-called opinion. Yes, they do have the right to do so. But when they do, they're saying, oh, we should be out of there. Why should we be out of there? I can't make that assessment because I, myself, have not done enough homework to say that we should or should not be in there. And I think this is where we have a major problem in our country. People are not getting themselves educated on anything. Republican, Democrat, Independent, whatever. They need to know what's going on. Obama, for instance, he had a couple books, Dreams from My Father, and also The Audacity of Hope, both of which I read in order to make my decision as to whether to vote or not vote for him. But I will say, on page 271 of The Audacity of Hope, he made a comment, and it really doesn't sit well with me, because he stated in the wake of 9/11, he was talking about all the stuff about the Pakistanis, about the glares, and he said, if the political wind should shift in an ugly direction, I am with them. He stated he would be with the Pakistanis. So I have a very, very, we have to educate ourselves, read everything you can come up with. And as far as our veterans, I applaud them. I'm looking to
All right,
help.
Marie, I'm sorry we're running out of time.
Well, Marcy, I will tell you that I need to look up on page 271. I've not read all of The Audacity, but I have read all the Dreams from My Father. And I think what you've done is very important. I just want to point out that I'm going to continue to get my foundation and knowledge built up. I have made 9 trips into that part of the world, and I know that you can't be up to speed on what's going on in a war theater unless you go there, and I'll go there and I take the briefings from our top officers, and then I go down the line and I talk to troops, and if I walk in the room, I'll say, anybody here from Iowa? Sometimes there's not, but when there are, we have an instant conversation in a frank way, and so I'll, if not, I'll find somebody else that will talk to me, and it gives you a sense of the flow of the operations, level of optimism, the level of sometimes discouragement that's there. But when you look in the eyes of our military, you see a look of dedication, a look of patriotism, and a look of nobility. They have put themselves on the line for us, and we owe them our best. But and that means too that those of us that take the stand that we support our military also need to take the stand that we support their mission. We cannot ask them to put their lives on the line for a mission that we say is the wrong mission. So it's support the troops and their mission. And if I have a disagreement with the president, I'm going to knock on the door of the White House and carry that message behind the scenes rather than through the press. But right now, I've just said I don't know enough, and I'm going to try to get up to speed on that and have a better opinion. And I'm likely, though, to support the continuation of our operations outside of Libya around with what we're doing today, if that comes up probably tomorrow on the floor of the House. Thank you very much.
Very quickly, Congressman King, what's the flood situation in your district?
Well, it's the worst flood that we have seen. The most water that's come down since 1952.
Missouri River.
Missouri River, which runs along the western border of Iowa. Sioux City, Iowa, Council Bluffs, Omaha on the Nebraska side of the river. And we have evacuated everybody that lives on the west side of I-29 from a certain mile marker south all the way down to Missouri. And that we have levees that have been overtopped in certain areas. This water is going to run about, I'm going to say, 2 to 3.5 or maybe 4 miles wide for the stretches clear up into South Dakota. But for the Iowa side, I can speak to about 170 miles of water, about from where around 2 to 2.5, 4 miles wide. And some of the water is just clear. And because the pressure from the water in the river pushes the water up out of the underground aquifer, it seeks its own level. When the level comes up in the river, it also comes up across the bottoms on the opposite side of some of the levees. We will see this flow of water come till at least August 2nd before it can be diminished. If there are heavier rains up above, then there will be more discharge coming down. But it'll be a long period of time of flood. This is going to take a lot of perseverance and a lot of pumping and a lot of monitoring. So even a little boil on the inside of a levee can open up that levee in a matter of minutes. We have to be there in order to patch that to save what we have. It's going to be a long summer for Iowans, Nebraskans, North and South Dakotans, and also it's now flushing its way down through Missouri. To understand how much water is coming down, more water than ever before since they built the 6 dams in the Pick-Sloan program that go on up into Montana. But if we didn't have the dams, and if all of the tributaries were dry except the Yellowstone, this flow of water that we have now that's more than ever before can come exclusively out of the Yellowstone. 150,000 cubic feet per second running out of the Yellowstone River alone, and that's the amount of water that's flowing down through Iowa now. The dams are holding the rest and metering it out. It'd be a lot worse if we didn't have the Pick-Sloan program.
Steve King is our guest, Republican from Iowa. As always, we appreciate your coming over.
Thank you, Peter.
Next up, the co-chair of the Progressive Caucus in the House.